Hello, welcome back to The Racing Gears, a series where I talk to some great names in motorsport, past and present, and find out the behind the scenes and behind the visor stories of the greatest sport in the world. Today's guest, we have a very special man who's very well known for his journalism in the motor racing scene, with the likes of Autosport magazine, all the way up to commentating on Formula One. But today he's going to tell us a little bit about his life in the fast lane. Simon Taylor, how are you?
Hello, good, Jake.
So if we start off early days, really, as a child, what sort of was captivating about the motor racing scene and the people involved in it? Was there something that really spurred that for you?
Well, people always ask me about this. My mother used to complain that I said the word car before I said the word mum. It was always a passion, not only with motorsport, but also with road cars. Today, road cars are terribly boring tin boxes, and they all look the same. But when I grew up in the late 40s and early 50s, all the cars were different. All small boys knew how to spot the difference between a standard Vanguard and a Triumph Renown. So it was initially, I suppose, an interest in road cars. But we lived fairly close to Castle Combe, which was already then a small club circuit. And I persuaded my parents to take me there when I was 7. So I saw my first motor race aged 7. I can remember standing in the rain by one of the corners at the old Castle Combe. And because nobody had heard of health and safety in those days, the crowd were protected from the cars by a single piece of string. And I saw Stirling Moss win the Formula 3 race in his 500cc Kieft, which I suppose was the start of me being a fan of Stirling Moss. I was used to say to Stirling that I'd been a fan for 30 years and then a friend for 30 years.
Yeah.
And then subsequently I was able to persuade my father to take me to Goodwood, which was a bit further to drive from my home in Somerset, but of course had a completely different level of racing.
Yeah.
For example, I was there in 1956, Easter Monday, when there was a wonderful Formula One race. You have to remember that in those days, Formula One cars didn't only run in the World Championship. Formula One had lots of non-championship races, which often were closer fought than the main Formula One races, because sometimes the Ferraris and Maserati works teams didn't turn up. So it was more of a battle between the Formula One Brits. And I saw a fantastic battle, Easter Monday 56, as I say, which I'll never forget, between Mike Hawthorne in the new 4-cylinder BRM, Stirling Moss in his own 250F Maserati, and Archie Scott-Brown, who was driving a Connaught. Well, Connaught was produced on an infinitely smaller budget by a small British racing team. Archie Scott-Brown was an incredibly brave driver with one hand, who initially had trouble persuading the authorities that he should have a license because he only had one hand. He had a short stub. His arm went down about to the elbow,
Okay.
His right arm. So what he would do is lean he had the seat in the cockpit set at a curious angle so that he was then able to steer while he was changing gear with his stump. Incredibly brave. His car control was quite remarkable, particularly in the wet, because since he'd been born with these deformities, his legs were also deformed. He'd learned to cope with that from childhood. And when you had a Le Mans start, which, as you'll remember, was what they used for sports car racing and used at Le Mans right up to the end of the 60s, where at the start the cars were lined up in echelon on one side of the road and the drivers stood at the other. The flag fell, the drivers ran across the road, jumped into their cars, had to start them and start the race. Mm-hmm. And Archie, with these funny little short legs, was always first to his car. He was an incredible character. And So I grew up gradually going to more and more races in the 50s and into the 60s. And in these days, when you think of Formula One, where the drivers are paid up to £500,000 a week, they're hidden away in motorhomes or behind wire fences so that you can't get into the paddock. In the 50s and the 60s, and even when I started covering Formula One for the BBC in the 70s, Formula One was a very small circus then. It was actually a minority sport. We're used to huge television coverage of Formula One, very good television coverage. We're used to big headlines in the newspapers. Formula One has kind of taken over the world. In those days, it was quite small.
Yeah.
In the daily newspapers, sadly, you often didn't get a story about the previous day's Grand Prix on Monday unless somebody had been killed, in which case they would have lurid pictures and write lurid stories about death and destruction. And you had a small number of drivers, usually very friendly drivers. You had the team bosses, you had the mechanics, and you had the journalists. And we all travelled together. We all travelled on the same plane. We probably all stayed in the same hotel. And they were all our friends, which meant, of course, when you wanted to go and talk to a driver or talk to a mechanic who often had more inside information, you could always access them. They knew you by name.
Yeah.
Obviously, they liked some journalists more than others. But there was this curious little Formula One village, which meant that you did become very friendly with the drivers. It also meant, of course, that when drivers were killed, which happened with horrifying regularity in those days, they were your friends that were being killed. I remember particularly in 1970, when Bruce McLaren was killed at Goodwood testing the latest Can-Am McLaren. I was then editing Autosport. He was killed on a Tuesday morning. We used to put the magazine to press on a Tuesday, and I got the phone call to say Bruce had been killed, and I had to rejig the front of the magazine and write an obituary off the top of my head. And that was difficult because we knew Bruce very well. He was the most approachable, modest, delightful man.
Yeah.
Which is why he was able to build up McLaren so quickly as he did, because people loved working with him. And he wrote a column, or Ian Young used to ghostwrite with him a column in the magazine almost every week. So that was in May. In July, Piers Courage, who was really a good mate. I mean, he was public school, enormously wealthy, but the reverse of a kind of aloof sporting hero. He was the most approachable, funny, entertaining man. You'd sit down with him after practice. I remember a great occasion. This is going to be much too long a story, and I'm sure it'll end up on the cutting room floor. But we were at a Formula 2 race in Spain. One of the great things in those days was the Formula 1 drivers also did Formula 2 on the kind of alternating weekends. And the drivers loved going to Formula 2 because it was much more relaxed. And then you could really get to know them. And I remember sitting with Piers in the paddock after Saturday practice, and we were talking, and suddenly it got to be about 6:45. And he said, "Look, I'm going back to the hotel. Why don't you come and have supper?" So I said, fine. Well, now I, as a penniless journalist, was staying in some doss house. He was staying in the Madrid Hilton, which in those days was a beautiful hotel. And he said, "Well, come round to the hotel, we'll have some supper." Well, I arrived at this very grand hotel wearing probably my only T-shirt. And I was stopped at the door by the maitre d'hotel, who said, "I'm sorry, sir, but you can't come into the dining room because you're not wearing a tie." I mean, let alone I wasn't wearing a shirt. But he said, "You're not wearing a tie." So Piers came over and said, "What's going on?" And I said, "Look, I'm sorry, Piers, I can't come in. I'm not properly dressed. I'll see you tomorrow." He said, "Nonsense, nonsense." He said, "Here is my room key. Go up to my room and I've got some ties in the wardrobe. Go and get me a tie. Go and get yourself a tie." So I went up to his suite at the Hilton. I opened the wardrobe and there were kind of rows of silk shirts and beautiful suits and several ties. So I chose one of the ties and I knotted it round my neck, even though I had no shirt, just a T-shirt, and went down to the dining room. And of course the matron of the hotel could do nothing about it because Piers Courage told me to come in. Well, that was the sort of relationship you had with the Formula One drivers. And 2 months later, Piers was killed. He was burned to death in the Dutch Grand Prix driving for Frank Williams in a De Tomaso. And having to write obituaries for your friends was very difficult. That was in July. In September, Jochen Rindt, who was leading the World Championship for Lotus, another man that I got to know very well because Jochen loved doing Formula 2 and won a lot of Formula 2 races. And Jochen was killed Saturday afternoon practice. That was 1970. In those days, I was just a print journalist. So I would be, excuse me, I'd be covering the races for Autosport magazine. By the mid-70s, I was covering Formula One on radio for the BBC, which I did for about 20 years. Mm-hmm. And even then, this was, later, but even then motor racing, Formula One, but also other types of motor racing, was extremely dangerous. And I'll never forget Imola. What was it, 1992, when Senna was killed? That was the most extraordinary weekend. Rubens Barrichello, driving for Ferrari, had a frightening accident in Friday practice. And I chatted to him on Saturday morning and he was a bit battered and bruised, but he said, no, I'm fine, it's all okay. Then on Saturday, lovely chap, I didn't know him particularly well, Austrian driver called Roland Ratzenberger. Yeah. He was killed Saturday afternoon.
Yeah.
And come Sunday, there was an extraordinary atmosphere in Imola because there'd been these two immense accidents and one death.
Yeah.
And although I'd interviewed Ayrton Senna and had to talk to him as a journalist, asking him questions, I didn't know Ayrton. Ayrton was not an easy man to know. He had a small number of people whom he was close to. And one of the people that he was very, very close to was Sid Watkins, Professor Sid Watkins, who was the Formula One doctor. He was a neurologist, a brain surgeon, but he loved Formula One and he would be at the races for every Grand Prix. He'd spend the whole race sitting in the course car with the engine running and usually a driver of Formula One standard sitting in the driving seat. And they had a lot of kit in the car. And if there was an accident, the car with Sid on board would rush to where the accident had happened. But Sid was the most extraordinary character. And I did know Sid very well. Went to stay with him in his place in Scotland. He was an extraordinary character and would tell you, as long as he knew you weren't going to publish it, he would tell you stories about Formula One drivers because he knew them. I mean, he'd seen them all with their underpants off. And all of the drivers respected him hugely. And they all also knew that if they had a terrible accident, they would depend on Sid. But there was an extraordinary relationship between Sid, Prof, we used to call him because he was a professor. Between Prof and Ayrton Senna, they were very, very close. Ayrton, who liked fishing, used to go up to Sid's place up in Scotland. He had a wonderful house I think on the Tweed, on a river, where they would fish together. And on Sunday morning at Imola, after Ratzenberger's death, Ayrton, who then, of course, was absolutely at the pinnacle of his career, then driving for Williams, and the best driver in the world at that point, he went to Sid and they talked about Ratzenberger's accident, and Ayrton always wanted to know detail. He wanted to know exactly why Ratzenberger had been killed. Was there a failure on the car? What were his bodily injuries? So Sid told him. I know all this because Sid, years later, told me this whole story. Obviously, it was a private conversation at that time. And Ayrton said to Sid, and you've got to remember he was the number one racing driver in the world at that stage, he said to Sid, I think I've had enough of this. I don't think I want to race anymore. I don't want to race this afternoon. And Sid said, look, if that's how you feel, you must not race. You've got to stop. Let's go fishing, come home and relax. You've made more money than you can ever spend. Announce your retirement now, and we'll go off and do something else. And Ayrton said, I would love to do that, but I can't. You think of my contract, you think what I owe to everybody. I can't do it. So, of course, that afternoon, it was Sid in the medical car who got to Ayrton first. And the extraordinary situation in Italy, the extraordinary situation in Italy is that if there is a death, the Italian authorities, excuse me, I'll have to start this answer again.
No,
this is my frog in my throat.
I think I know what you're going to say. Actually, it's they have to. Somebody has to be at fault, don't they?
Yes, exactly.
If somebody's died.
That's right. I mean, that's why when Jochen was killed, Colin Chapman said to Peter Waugh, or said to whoever was nearest from the team organisation, I'm leaving. And before anybody had really knew what had happened, Colin Chapman was in a car and he was gone, and left it to the other people to sort out. And the dispute about Jochen's death went on for years. Well, it was the same with Ayrton.
Very much so, yeah.
They could not allow the authorities to see that Ayrton had actually died on the spot. He was dead, but he had the most terrible injury because one of the suspension rods had gone through his helmet. So he was put in the helicopter and he was flown away. And then officially they announced that he hadn't died at Imola. He died on his way to the hospital. And it sounds absolutely ridiculous, but that altered the situation between the team and the authorities, even though there was a horrible sort of dispute that went on between the Williams team and the Italian authorities looking for blame and so on. Well, what I particularly remember about that was that I was doing the BBC radio commentary, as I always did. Murray, my good friend Murray Walker, was doing the TV commentary in the next box. And everything had stopped. Obviously, they'd stopped the race. And nobody quite knew what was going on. Nothing had been announced. There were television pictures of the wrecked car, and we'd seen Sid there. The Italian television, they were pretty ruthless. They would show anything they could. So those were the pictures we were looking at. And BBC television, it was busy Sunday afternoon for sport, so they quite quickly because nothing seemed to be happening and nothing had been announced. They quite quickly said in Murray's ear, "OK, Murray, hand back to the studio." So Murray handed back and they went to the cricket or the football or the athletics, whatever. My commentary was going out similarly into a busy Sunday afternoon live sports coverage, and I was longing for them to say in my ear, "OK, hand back to the studio." But because Ayrton Senna having a huge accident was a big story, they didn't. So I was stuck in the commentary box, which incidentally didn't have windows. It was just a little cubicle with a television screen and a timing screen. And I just had to keep talking. And, well, as you've already gathered in this interview, I don't have trouble talking, but even so, that was a very difficult hour.
Yeah.
When I just had to keep talking about Formula One, about Williams, and about Ayrton, of course.
Was it fairly obvious what had happened at that point, or?
Yes, well, you always, fear the better, if you see what I mean. You always hope for the better. But Formula One, I have to admit, I don't like modern Formula One at all. I covered and worked in Formula One for 25 years, and it is so different now. It's a wonderful sport. The television coverage is superb. And obviously the technology is amazing.
Unbelievable. Yeah.
And the cars are very, very safe. We see on our television screens horrendous accidents and drivers walking away, which is, of course, wonderful.
20 years ago, that wouldn't have been the case, would it?
Absolutely not. Well, certainly 40 years ago.
Yeah.
My feeling about Formula One today, and this is not, I'm not saying anything very clever or anything that hasn't been said by other people. The very fact that the technology is so extraordinary, and you have not only an incredible team at the race, but you have scores of people sitting at home in Bicester or wherever it is in electronic communication, not only with the pits, but actually with the car. Mm-hmm. And Max Verstappen is obviously a very extremely talented driver. But the man who's really won the World Championship this year, again, is Adrian Newey.
Yeah.
Because the driver is not the most important link in the chain anymore. It's the design of the car. It's the way that, as Adrian said to me once, what he loves is the publication of the new rules. Because when the new rules are published, he rolls up his sleeves, metaphorically, and he goes through the rules, and he is cleverer than anybody else at exploiting those rules to build a racing car that goes faster than anybody else is. And it's really Adrian and the technology who is winning the races. And I think that's a shame.
It is. You read Adrian Newey's book, and that's absolutely how he puts it, really. It's a case of they sit there and find the loopholes in the in the next year's rules, and Max is an absolutely fantastic driver, as you've said. But if he hasn't got the right piece of kit, and that's where it sort of differs from perhaps your era of Formula One, you could have pretty much put Ayrton Senna in a lot of the cars on that grid, and he would have come out on top. And even in the previous days, which was almost sort of what would be considered now as club sport, where they literally turned up on the back of a trailer being pulled by a Morris Minor.
Absolutely.
And it was the best driver that won, really.
Well, I mean, there weren't motorhomes.
No.
I remember it's an extraordinary race in 1969 at Silverstone when the two top men that year were Jackie Stewart driving for a Matra run by Tyrrell, and Jochen driving for Lotus. And there was the most wonderful battle that went on between Stewart and Rindt, and they were changing places and battling wheel to wheel for the entire race. And then Jochen had to make a pit stop because the end plate one of his rear wing, one of the end plates, was presumably because of the aerodynamic forces, was coming adrift and rubbing on his rear tyre. So he had to stop, which of course enraged him, because he always believed that the Lotuses were too fragile. And of course, tragically, it was a fragility of a front inboard brake rod that killed him. So he came into the pits. They sorted out the end plate. I think they took it off, actually, just tore it off, and off he went again. But he was still sort of up there. I mean, I think he was running 4th or 5th or something. He was going to score some points. Probably by the end of the race, he would have made up more points. But then the car started to run out of petrol. Now, Colin Chapman was neurotic about weight. He would always calculate to 3 places of decimals what the car's fuel consumption would be and how little fuel to put in. And Bob Dance, still with us, wonderful man who was for years one of Lotus's chief mechanics. They always used to have something called the mechanic's gallon. And when Colin Chapman wasn't looking, the car would all be filled up and ready for the race. They'd put another gallon in because they didn't want their driver to run out of petrol.
It's a silly thing to lose on after all of the work that's gone into it, isn't it?
I don't know what a gallon of petrol weighs, but not very much.
Not a lot at all.
And they had put in the mechanic's gallon. But the race had been so intense and they were breaking the lap record all the time. But of course, Colin Chapman's calculations were wrong, and Rindt's car started to run out of petrol. Well, after the race, you didn't have post-race television interviews then. The winner might be interviewed over the public address commentary, and you didn't have motorhomes. So Jochen came storming out of the back of the Lotus pit, striding off to the transporter, because they used to change in the back of the transporter. And he was changing in the back of the transporter. I had my report to write. I needed to know. He'd made a pit stop. We didn't know why. And then the car had slowed dramatically, misfiring at the end. It was my job to find out what had happened. I was the first person to get to Jochen. And Jochen was still in a rage. So, and also he knew me well enough that he knew he could say what he thought in front of me, and I wasn't going to go and put it in the magazine the next week. And I cherish that conversation with Jochen. I mean, I can't repeat it because there were more 4-letter words than other words. He was absolutely in a rage, and he wasn't getting on with Chapman very well then, partly because what he saw was the unreliability of the cars. He was the fastest man that year. They were in the 49. Well, the 72 was sort of coming.
Yeah, but the 49 was
49 was the car.
Yeah.
And he, at that stage, I'm going into too much detail, and all of this can disappear, but that was just when Max Mosley and Robin Hurd were plotting to start the March team. In fact, the Formula 3 prototype March with Ronnie Peterson appeared at Cadwell Park, I think, in the September. We hadn't heard of March before then. But Jochen knew that that Formula 3 car was being built in a shed by a man called Graham Coker, who was part of Max Mosley's little clique. And Jochen knew that this March team was being set up. And obviously Max Mosley had breathed in his ear and told him what was happening. And Jochen was on the point of telling Colin Chapman to get stuffed and signing for Max Mosley's new team the following year. Chapman, fortunately, realised that he was about to lose Jochen and really kind of made love to Jochen and persuaded him that everything would be well, and that the new Lotus 72 was going to be a world beater, which it was.
Yeah.
So Jochen stayed. But the point of all of this is that Graham Coker, building this little car in his shed, Jochen said words to this effect, and he had his Austrian accent. I know this is car being built in Graham's shack, which was his way of saying Graham's shack.
Right.
And before they came up with the name March, Max Mosley referred lightheartedly to what was going to become March as Graham's Shack Engineering. Right, well, that's the story about March.